and welcome to this session on Getting Started with Salesforce Functions by Stephan Garcia. I'm sure many of you out there have been hearing about Salesforce Functions for a while now. So in this session, Stephan will give us a brief overview and demo of how Salesforce Functions work. A few housekeeping rules before we start. Please use the live Q&A feature in the AirTouch to submit any questions during or after the presentation. And we'll have a short Q&A after the session where we will review and address some of your questions based on time. Okay. If you have any buffering issues, please make sure you click on the audio video issues link below the main screen, and you can try switching to a different backup stream as well. Okay. With that, let me pass control to our speaker for today. Over to you, Stephan. Take it away.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's session. First off, before we get into it, I want to thank the organizers for really being able to put together this event and all the hard work that goes into organizing these, especially when we're all online and virtual. And I think it's just great for all of these organizers to come together from different countries and really put together this session. It's great to be here virtually. One day I'd love to be there in person. I've had the pleasure of visiting many of the countries represented here today in the last few years and would love to come and see everyone in person. Now, today we're going to be talking about a favorite subject of mine, and that is Salesforce Functions. And primarily, I want to give you a closer look at how you can get started with functions and how they really work. Now, we have to thank the sponsors for making this event possible. It's very important that we continue to support them as they support events around the community. Because without them, we really can't make this happen. And as we start to get back to being in person, we're going to need sponsors more than ever. So please check out their sites, visit them. Some great information that you could learn and about some great apps that you may have not heard of before. And so to start off, to introduce myself, my name is Stephan Chandler-Garcia, and I'm a developer advocate at Salesforce. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, my handle is StephanWCG. Or you can email me directly if you have any questions at stephan.garcia@salesforce.com. Now, I'm not new to community events. I'm not new to Salesforce. I've been in the ecosystem for almost 10 years now as a customer, as a partner, as an ISV, and now I work for Salesforce as a developer advocate. And it's great to be here in this role because I get to really connect with the developer community and help you out with your problems and really understand how we can teach you about some of our new technology and ensure that everyone's up to scratch on what's coming. And so before we get started, we are talking about Salesforce Functions today. And while everything we're going to be talking about is now generally available, please make all of your purchasing decisions based off of our currently available technology and not anything future or forward-looking that we might bring up in today's session. And now with that, let's get started with the agenda. We're going to start off with an intro to Salesforce Functions, just so that you can have a little bit more background on why functions are important. We're then going to talk about getting started with functions and how you can actually get your hands on an org. We're then going to be talking about the Salesforce SDK and how important that is to accessing and using Salesforce within functions. We're going to talk about invoking a function and then do a quick demo. And then we have time for a Q&A right after the session. So, where do functions really fit into this cloud computing world? We can start off by taking a step back, okay? We're all familiar nowadays with software as a service. That's where Salesforce fits in. We have lots of applications like Sales Cloud, Service Cloud that you can buy and use to provide solutions. We have things like platform as a service, like the Salesforce core platform itself, where you can use that platform to extend, to build applications. We have things like Heroku, which you can use. There are companies that provide infrastructure as a service like AWS, Google Cloud, and Azure, where you can procure literal servers to put your applications on. And we have backends as a service like Firebase, Amplify, and an infinite number of tools that we can use. And as part of all of that, we have functions as a service. Now, functions as a service are nothing new. Functions have been around for a while now, and there are lots of services like functions in Lambda on AWS, Azure Functions, and all kinds of different platforms. Now, when we take a look at what a function actually is, functions have been around since around 2014, and they are a single purpose piece of code, okay? that means that that function is built and written to do a single thing, like maybe generate a QR code, run a complex calculation. Okay, a function is on demand, which means that that function can be called when you need it. So it's always there, it's always available. So we've got that single purpose, that single calculation, that single process that's called exactly when you need it and always available. Now, the next stage of that is that a function is short-lived. Okay, a function is only running for the time that's necessary to complete that purpose at that specific point in time that it's been required. Okay, and it is a microservice. Okay, that does not need complex infrastructure. You're not having to stand up your servers. You're not having to write your API gateways, at least in this case. And it's just always available for you, depending on how many times you need it, how many times it's called, and will always be there when you need access to it. Okay, so just taking a step back again, a function is a single purpose microservice, a single purpose piece of code that you're using to complete an action whenever you need it. So how does this relate to Salesforce? Well, we've introduced Salesforce Functions. What's great about Salesforce Functions is they have all that power provided by Salesforce on top of that functions idea, the idea of having a microservice that you can just go and access when you need it. Now, what makes this great, number one, is that it can scale elastically. If you need to access this function a million times, it's always there for you to access, and you can scale up and down without worry. Part of the runtime that's managed by Salesforce allows you to scale those functions as much as you need without having to worry about adding dynos, adding any capacity, because it's all done automatically for you. It is super flexible to work with functions because they have native access to Salesforce data inside of Node and Java. So if you're writing a function in JavaScript, you can ask support or ask for help from developers within your organization to help you write that function. Or if you have Java developers in your organization, you can take advantage of them to help you write functions. This is a huge benefit because we now have an extra set of resource and ideas that we've never had before within Salesforce, because we have access to those people and to those information. On top of that, you also have access to all of those libraries. Think about all the different NPM packages that you can use to bring into functions to do all kinds of really cool stuff and really take off a lot of the heavy load processing that you may be used to or having to work around with using Apex, or maybe having to write middleware for at the moment. And more importantly, it helps you deliver connected experiences, because functions can be exposed through pro code and low code solutions, like writing and calling your functions from Apex. You can access them in Flow through an invocable method. You can trigger them multiple ways. You can even call a function from a Lightning Web Component. There are all kinds of great ways to access functions to really improve the business process and do that alongside of Salesforce and not have to call out to a third-party system. Now, like I said a minute ago, what makes functions great, number one, is that elastic scale. The fact that you can go and run that function whenever you need to and have access to it and not have to worry about some of the platform limits that you may usually hit with Salesforce. For example, one that's always got me is the fact that you can only use a file or get a file in Apex that is 6 megabytes when processing synchronously or 12 megabytes when processing asynchronously, which can be a huge blocker when doing integrations with large data volumes. However, a function does not have that same limit, so you can break outside those boundaries when working with large files in functions. And there are many use cases in which that becomes important, and you can find and identify them and see which one works for you. Number two is that we're staying on platform. I think that's super important. The fact that we're inside of that Salesforce trust boundary and we can access our functions directly within Salesforce. And that's an advantage from a security perspective, but as well as from an ease of use perspective. Keep in mind that Salesforce functions have a different API limit than your Salesforce org. It's a totally separate bucket of API calls that you're allowed. And even by using things like the SDK, just the ease of use is incredible when building functions and integrating them into Salesforce. And then lastly, like I said, you can expand your talent pool. You may have access to JavaScript and Java developers inside of your organization already, and it allows you to rely on other people's skills versus a Salesforce developer to work on the functions and allow you to work across your company a lot more. In most instances, it will be very rare that you only have Salesforce developers at your organization, and this gives us the opportunity to bring all of our developers together to work on a similar project or really work together and get some interesting results from functions. However, it's important to note that you shouldn't always be using functions for everything. A lot of the examples that we provide do things like run a SQL query or do some basic DML into Salesforce, which are actions that you don't actually want to run out to a function for. Number one, you need to ask yourself if you need that extra processing power. Okay, if what you're trying to do can't be accomplished in Apex, then great, use a function. If you think about compute heavy and already async things that you may be doing are maybe querying a complex quote line items, querying products and price rules, running some calculations, maybe even updating a quote or generating a PDF. These are all things that can be quite compute heavy that you aren't able to do in Salesforce. If you don't actually need the new processing power, you can then ask yourself if you're pushing or reaching Apex limits. If you are, and your transaction needs to run in that same chain and that logic needs to run in the transaction, then go ahead and use Apex, okay? And if you're not hitting limits, then obviously write everything that you're doing in Apex. So things like all of your CRUD, approval workflows, utilize triggers, and all that capability, because you don't always need to go out to functions. Bear in mind that there is a limit to the amount of invocations that you can have within functions. However, you can gain and purchase an additional limit on top of that, but it's important to note that you should only be using the functions when you really need to. Okay, so how do we get started? Well, let's first talk about the anatomy of a function and what our function actually is. And so, for example, in JavaScript, each function exports an async function. It's a mouthful there. And this is where all of the work is done. And you'll see here when we're actually exporting that function here, we're passing in three things. We've got our event, our context, and the logger. And inside of this function, we can do anything that we need to, that we can then return into Salesforce or call it to another system, etc. Now, when we start to work with functions, it's important to note that the event contains the payload that was passed into the function. So anything that you're passing from Salesforce into the function in that payload will appear in the event. The context allows you to access the org that's been authenticated with the Salesforce SDK. And so with that context, you actually have direct access to Salesforce and you're authenticated to Salesforce and you can perform actions, which we'll go through in the next few slides. And then lastly, we have the logger that helps you write logs right from this function and will enable you to debug using that logger. So when we're invoking the function, it's important to note that functions can be invoked directly from Apex. Okay, you can use the functions.function class to get a function reference and invoke it by passing in that JSON payload. You can get the response right from the function.function invocation object, and you can invoke them synchronously or asynchronously. And so you can see here, we have our public class here for our function invoker, and that's where we're going to take the string and we're going to invoke that function. We can pass in the function name that we want to call and the payload. Here you can see we're calling that functions.function class, giving it a name, calling it our function, and that's where we're going to go and actually get the function reference from the server. Then we can take that function and invoke it. And you'll see here it's storing that response inside of our function invocation. That then allows us to then get the response. Now, try saying that 5 times fast. Obviously, we're using the word function a lot in there, but it just shows how simple it is to just call that function from Apex and pass in the payload and get back your response. Now, asynchronously, we're going to do the same thing, except we're just going to pass in a callback. And in that callback, you can see here, we're going to get the response. And so it's very, very easy. And any Apex developer will have such an easy time calling functions from Apex. And you'll understand how really closely linked together having functions are to Salesforce. Makes it easier than ever to really access functions and innovate around some of this technology. So next up, let's talk about the Salesforce SDK. Now, the Salesforce SDK is available in your functions. We're going to talk about the JavaScript SDK in this session, and it contains a number of interfaces. Number one, we have got the context interface that I mentioned earlier that allows you to gain access to all of this org information. We have the data API that allows you to query and perform CRUD operations against Salesforce. We have the org that gets you information around the current user, information around the org, like the URL, the org ID, user ID, who's accessed the function. We have the unit of work pattern, which we're going to go through as well. That will show you how to create graphs of records using the composite graph API and push those into Salesforce using that same technology. However, because it's in JavaScript, it's really easy to write and use. Then we have the user object that gives you information about the current user. And there's a lot more to learn, but we're going to keep it to these basic ones today because they're enough to get you started. So first off, in the context interface, we have the org interface. And this gives you information about the attached Salesforce org and access to the data and API user interfaces. And you can see here in this example function, we're going to take that context here, and we're going to create a constant for our org info. And in that org info object, we're going to pass in that context.org.id to get the org ID. We have the API version, we have the base URL, we have the domain URL. All four of these things are great to use inside of your function because you may need access to that information when you're generating an API callback into Salesforce potentially, or creating some references to Salesforce, or maybe you need to get access to the user ID. Okay. Next, we have that user interface we were just mentioning. Now here in this example, we can create a constant for user info, and we can pass in that context.org.user reference and get the ID. We can access the on behalf of user ID so that we can track the person who initiated the request through their action, like maybe a button click or a record update. And then we can use that info in our function, which is great for assigning ownership of records or initiating a transaction based on that person who's triggered the function instead of the current user who's running as the admin. Next, we have the data API interface, and this is really cool. This gives us direct access to Salesforce data. Now, once again, it's through that context interface, through the org interface, and then you have that data API. And in this example, we're going to use the query function here to select an ID from a list of accounts. Now, what's great about this is we can write SOQL just like we're used to from our function and gain access to the data. Now, in this example, we are just querying and returning back to Salesforce, which is something you would never actually want to do in a function. However, you may need to query Salesforce for data, for metadata that you can use inside of your function so that you can do the processing, so that you're not having to pass everything in the payload. It's a great way to gain access to that data and enrich your function with some of your information from Salesforce. Next, you can see here that we're using that data API create interface. In the last slide, we looked at the query interface, but this one is for create. And here you can see what we can do is set the type of record that we'd like to create, and then we can set the fields. And so you can see here, we've got our type here as just an account, and then we have an object that we're creating for fields that we can use to pass in values. Now, this is a very basic example where we're just passing in an account name, but this shows you how you can really easily perform DML using that data API within a function. Now, next, the coolest part is we have the unit of work interface. And so once again, this is now a part of the context interface, the org interface, and the data API. And as part of the data API, we have that unit of work. Now, when we create a new unit of work, we're going to take that unit of work constant here, and we can register DML statements against it. And so in this example, we've got a unit of work.register create, where we're passing in the type of account and the field of account name. Now, we can also attach graphs of records to this, just like we do with the composite graph API. And so you can see here on the first slide, we're creating an account. So next, we can then create a contact. And you can see here, we're going to create a contact. We're registering that create again. We've got the last name here from the payload, and then the account ID. This account ID is a reference from that previous operation that allows us to relate the account and the contact together within that single transaction. Here you can see we're also going to create a case where we can set the fields, we're setting the subject, the description, and then we can assign the account ID and the contact ID to this case from those previous two operations. We can insert this one graph, or we can create a graph containing multiple graphs and then upload them into Salesforce. And now it does follow the same limits as the composite graph API. So you can do up to 500 graphs in that single transaction. But that is a great way to quickly create all of this data right from our function Okay, now, so how do we get started? So I'm really happy to announce that my team has been working on the Functions Recipes sample app. Now, this sample app is available on GitHub. It's available on developer.salesforce.com, and it contains lots of realistic examples around how you can use functions with Java, JavaScript, and TypeScript, with more languages coming soon. Now, each recipe takes a piece of the SDK and shows you how you can actually write and deploy a function into your org. It's worth noting functions are now generally available. There will be a trial sign up coming soon. So keep an eye on the Salesforce Devs Twitter handle for more information and the announcement of when that trial is available. So without further ado, let's go ahead and take a look inside a functions recipe so you can see how functions work. So when you install functions recipes, you will be in a Salesforce org. We have an app created called Functions that allows you to interact with all of the examples. Now, for example, we've created an org info function. We're going to start out quite basic. And so this org info function takes everything that I was showing you in the SDK and allows you to just view some org information. So in the UI, you can see the code here. You can see we've got our function here that we're exporting. Okay, and on execute, we've got our event, our context, and our logger. Okay. The first thing we need to do is check that the org is connected properly. This will let us know that the function is running. And then we have our org info. We've got our type here. So we've got our org info class, and we're getting our API version, our base URL, our domain URL, our ID, and our user. And it's going to return those. This function uses TypeScript, by the way. So that's why you see these type definitions. Okay. Now, in order to run this, we can just press run function, and it's going to show us information from that org. And this is running right against our function itself. So it's called out to the function through Apex. It's been able to return the API version, the base URL, the domain, and all this information right from our function. Like I mentioned earlier, this is very useful when actually running the function, accessing this data inside of the function for you to do further processing. Now, another example that we have is our Salesforce SDK. Okay. This one is going to show us how we can take an account name, a number, an industry, a type, and a website, and create some data in Salesforce. And we're going to use that data API create here to create an account. Okay. What we can do is view this source and then run the function. We can provide it a name. Let's call this one SForce. We'll give it an account number. So it's technology. Okay, and let's go ahead and invoke this function. What it's going to do is it's going to generate a payload with this information and invoke our function. Okay, and like that, it's gone through and it's created our function for us. You can see here, it's created one record, and the record information we have is here. And it's returning all of the fields from that account to us so that we can see them. And so like that, we've been able to create an account directly from a function. Now let's go ahead and use that data API query to query that account. So here, once again, we've got another function where in this function, we're passing in just a keyword in that event. And so here you can see we're saying, okay, our keyword, make sure it's a string, and then we can run that SOQL query. So we're going to select ID and name, and then select name and email from contacts from account where name is like this. Now, I didn't create a contact, so there aren't going to be any contacts returned. So let's go ahead and see what we return here. So let's run this function. Let's call it SForce and invoke. And like that, there you go. It's found our account. However, there are no contacts for it to return because I haven't created one in this org in that transaction. Next, we can go through and check out that unit of work. So let's do this again. This one we will be able to query. So let's go ahead and run this function. The first name is going to be Stephan. There, get my information. Let's go SForce 1. Okay, and let's go ahead and invoke that. And what that's done is it's used that unit of work pattern to create that graph in one single transaction where it's created an account ID, a contact ID, and then 2 service cases all in one transaction. And so if we go back to our data API query, we should have two accounts now with a contact that comes back from this function. So let's go ahead and use Sforce again and go ahead and invoke that. And there you go. You can see we have two records here. We've got an account, one that has a contact with my name, Stephan W. Garcia. Then we have an account that has no contact. So just a great way that you can really use functions to create records in Salesforce, to query data in Salesforce. Now, once again, these aren't things that you would actually be doing with a function. They're ways that you would be accessing data and using inside of a more complex function. Now, to give you a quick example of that, we created a bulk API function. Now, what this function does is it takes a CSV file that's been placed on a server, which is a very common integration pattern that you will see. And here you can see that we're going to go ahead and we're going to go and get that CSV from a file. Then we're going to use our authorization here. So you can see we have our auth headers here, where we can then go and actually post this job to the Salesforce Bulk API 2.0, which is going to take that CSV and actually upsert those account files with an external ID. This is a very common scenario that you would usually have to write middleware for. However, now you can write this in a function. And so what we can do is go ahead and run this function, and it's going to go and get that file from the server, and it's going to create this bulk job for us to insert all of those records into Salesforce. This is a great use case and very commonly something that people will be using functions for. So hopefully that gives you a great overview of the Functions Recipes app and how you can interact with it. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to go through a lot of the code today, but the whole repo is there for you to access. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. Let's go ahead and go on to the live Q&A so that we can answer some of your questions about functions. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephan, for that wonderful session on Salesforce Functions. I'm really looking forward to checking out the recipes that your team has put together. So now we'll go through a few questions that we have from our audience. And starting with, and I'm sure you get this a lot, when would functions be available? And if so, when can we get hands-on in that, especially the dev edition orgs?
Yeah, totally. No, it's the most common question. So if you are a Salesforce customer and you have a production org, you can now get Salesforce Functions into your org by talking to your account manager. Now, if you're a developer who may not have a production org available, or a customer, or maybe you're a partner, Salesforce Functions will not be available in developer edition orgs. However, they will be available in a trial org, so that you will be able to sign up and get an org that has functions associated to it. It is a production org, so it's a trial like you would sign up for to try out something like Shield or Einstein Analytics, or sorry, Tableau CRM now. And you'll be able to use functions for 30 days. Now, that doesn't stop you from using functions, however, as you can run and hook up your functions environment to an org locally. So without having a functions-enabled org, you can still write functions and start to get to know how to use functions by running them locally. And if you check out the developer guide, it'll walk you through how we can do that.
Okay. So it's kind of related to it. Yeah, it's kind of a question related to what Luis was asking. So the hosting for Salesforce, is it on the Salesforce platform? Is it or an external server platform?
Yeah, so the functions runtime is on Heroku. Now, that is obfuscated, though, from you, so you won't ever have to actually be logging into Heroku or managing it there. When you deploy functions through the command line, they will push up to a space that's linked directly to your org, and that handles all of the infrastructure, all of the authentication, so that you're not actually ever having to touch any of that, which is one of the huge benefits of Salesforce Functions, is because it's so tightly integrated in your org that you don't need to know anything about the surrounding technology stacks, and you can just access them directly from Apex.
Got it. Awesome. Thank you. We have a question from Prakash. He's asking, can we use functions and flows?
Yep. And so inside of functions recipes, you'll see there is an example where we call a function from a flow. At the moment, functions have to be called through Apex. And so you can write an invocable method that just points to your function and allows you to pass data back and forth. Inside of the recipes app, there's actually a generic function invoker so that you can really easily call any function directly from your flow by just passing in its name. And so there's some sample code for that. So even if you aren't familiar with Apex, you can go into the recipes app and just take that generic code, and you'd be able to point to any function right from a flow through that invocable.
Awesome. Thanks, Stephan. Okay, so I'll combine the next question with one of the questions I had from earlier as well. It's more to do with the security aspect. So if you can take a few minutes to explain, because people will have questions on okay, especially our customers, right? Functions is new. We're talking about this external, where it's going through Heroku behind the scenes. Are there any security features that are provided from Salesforce, or that we need to take into consideration? And related to that, Mira is asking, for DMLs, is there security checks inside the functions, or are we just using the admin user credentials?
Of course. So currently, it's slightly different. So functions are running as the platform integration user. However, it is modified. So there's a permission set that's created in the org called functions. Okay. And that functions permission set is applied to the cloud integration user at runtime. And so you apply permissions based on that general access to a function currently. So no matter who is invoking it, it's going to run in that context of the platform integration user at the end of the day with that said permission set. So it's slightly modified from the platform integration user that you're used to. You can't modify it directly. It's programmed by the system. And so that's why we provide that permission set separately that's automatically applied every time. So if you need to give them access to specific custom objects or data, you can do it that way. Now, it is important to note that currently you can't do sort of field access checks against a user through functions because it's meant to sit on top of your Salesforce org and process data that way. So think about large-scale integration tasks, not necessarily specific user interaction-driven events. Now, in future, we will be able to access that function as a specific user in Salesforce, but that's currently on the roadmap and not in the initial GA version of functions.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephan.
But they don't just have access to everything because they're not the admin.
Okay, got it. Right. I think that's all the questions that we have for now, Stephan. Do you have any last parting thoughts for the audience before we wrap up?
No, I mean, just thank you all for attending the session. I know Salesforce functions are something that has been asked about a lot in the last couple of years since we made the first announcement. And it's great to see customers and developers actually starting to get their hands and use functions and come up with some pretty cool stuff.
Okay, awesome, cool. Well, thank you very much, Stephan, for this wonderful session. And then I will ask, if anybody has any additional questions, you have Stephan's email from the presentation earlier or his Twitter contact. Please do reach out to him. Even on this platform, you can connect with him while he's online. And before we leave, please do help us improve by completing the short survey after this session. It will just take a few seconds and will give us a great feedback on how we can improve. Okay. So you can now exit back to the auditorium, choose the next session that we have that you would like to attend. And thank you very much for joining us today, and have a good day, everyone. Thank you, Stephan.
Thank you.